Layered Insight is the industry's first embedded security approach for containers. Trusted by Global 1000 enterprises to secure their containerized applications, it's the only solution that requires no root privileges, has zero dependency on the underlying infrastructure, and is fully portable across any container environment. Unify DevOps and SecOps, enabling the rapid development of containerized applications without worrying about security. To learn more, please visit layeredinsight.com/ASW. Rapid7 powers the practice of SecOps. Using shared data, analytics, and automated workflows, SecOps unites IT, DevOps, and security teams to make security an outcome of innovation. Rapid7 combines technology, expertise, and advocacy to drive vulnerability management, application security, incident detection, and log management for more than 7,000 organizations worldwide. Power up your SecOps practice with a free trial at rapid7.com/securityweekly. Hard-coded credentials can be trouble, but not as much trouble as a vulnerable DevOps environment. If you want protection without the hassle of security slowing you down, CyberArk, the #1 provider in privilege access security, has the solution for you. With CyberArk Conjure, developers can easily secure secrets across any DevOps toolchain or platform, whether your application runs in the cloud or on premises. Eliminate the headaches of managing secrets and try Conjure open source for free with no strings attached. Visit conjure.org/ASW to get started today. Signal Sciences is the industry's first web protection platform that works in any cloud, any container, any platform as a service, and any modern application architecture. The Signal Sciences web protection platform can be deployed in next-generation WAF, RASP, or reverse proxy modes, giving customers ultimate flexibility and coverage. Protect your web applications with Signal Sciences web protection platform. Signal Sciences, protecting applications, connecting teams. For more information, check them out at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome back, everyone, to Application Security Weekly. We got some interesting stories this week. First up, a Boeing 757 was hacked remotely while it sat on the runway. This was pretty crazy to me because, it's sitting in the runway. Obviously, people are sitting in terminals and they probably have Wi-Fi access of some kind. And back in September of 2016, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security revealed it was able to successfully hack an airliner while it was on the ground in Atlantic City, New Jersey. The funniest part about this article, Paul, is they said, don't panic too much. The hack of the legacy commercial airliner was an exercise conducted by a team of security professionals. That doesn't make me feel any better, Paul. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I was wondering what the context was around this story. I mean, obviously it was a controlled test, so and they kind of made it sound like it wasn't in the headline, right? Like, oh my God, someone hacked an airplane. But, I mean, it's a system like anything else. Of course, people are going to be able to gain unauthorized access to it. The question is how they did it. What were the details of it? What did they get access to? Define hacked here, right?
Right. And so the little articles that they gave, so this was a CyberSat summit in Tysons Corner, Virginia, that this was revealed. The details are that in this case, they kept it classified, of course, but it did involve accessing and gaining control of the plane systems through radio frequency communications. Surprise, surprise, right? So we've had a number of discussions lately, both on Paul's Security Weekly as well as this show, on radio frequency hacks, whether it was the actual door locks for, NFC, for example, or in this case, the sirens that were also hacked via the radio signals back in, I think it was Austin, Texas. So I think this is yet another situation where basically they've depended too much on radio signals or radio frequency communications to planes that in the past people didn't have the technology to actually, generate the kind of radio signals they need to generate to talk to these things. And well, now they can. So the thing that I got out of this, though, which to me I thought was, I don't know if it was crass is the right word, but at the end of the article, they stated that the cost to change one line of code on a piece of avionics equipment is $1 million, and it takes about a year to implement. So in effect, it would bankrupt a company such as like Southwest Airlines if they had to go ahead and update the code and update the systems on those planes. And in my mind, it's a situation of, yes, it is a localized attack if someone has to be in an airport to mess with the plane's avionics via radio frequency before it takes off. But even still, it's almost like, it's going to cost too much to fix it, so therefore we're not going to. Doesn't sound like the greatest excuse in this situation, which I thought was really, I don't know, Paul, do you have any thoughts to add here before we jump to a different story?
Well, yeah, I think, it's a matter of risk, and there's a big difference between, I can get on and maybe access the in-flight entertainment system, and maybe plant something that tries to, Trojan or drive by everyone who accesses it versus controlling the plane's avionics equipment. Big difference there, right? And that's gonna, if the bug does cause, or the security vulnerability does cause that much to fix, you're going to balance that with the risk. Now, we don't know exactly the details of the attack, so it's tough for us to say. Let's just hope, because most of us get in airplanes more than a couple of times a year, that it's nothing major, right?
Right. Well, not to mention too, right? If you can do malicious things that not only just affect the in-flight entertainment, but the actual avionics, right? And you're sitting in an airport, you could hit hundreds of planes in a single day, right?
Sure.
Because it's the 757 and the 737 models are pretty popular, especially by I think Delta flies those as well as Southwest and others, right? So to that end, it's like a situation of here's hoping, but at the same time, as we've come to find it, in many cases, malicious actors get very creative with the ways that they adopt what is otherwise state agency techniques and tactics, right? So I think it's probably a matter of time before someone manages to figure out what was done here. But then again, getting your hands on or getting near a 737 or 757 to practice this sort of thing is not easy to do. So to that end, I'm just hoping that airlines will perhaps start to take this into their R&D process and deliver secure by default before they actually, ship them to the customers that are purchasing them. So that's kind of my final thoughts there. I did want to skip ahead to the Twitter story here, which was late breaking news. I think it was Thursday of last week, where Twitter said all 336 million users should change their passwords because in this case, the company found that they were storing user passwords in plain text and an internal log as part of their system. What was most interesting about this to me is they use Bcrypt, and as does GitHub, who had a similar issue earlier in the week affecting a smaller number of their customers. And that they are logging anything that could be related to credentials before it actually gets hashed was most interesting to me in particular. But the thing that I find kind of ironic here is I think that as we get closer to GDPR being delivered here in a few weeks, we're going to see more of this story because people are going back and looking for things like, log files with passwords in them. Paul, do you have anything to add?
I think it sounds to me, if I had to venture a guess, there's usually debug code involved that someone accidentally left in that is writing it to a log file before the encryption process takes place, which, the likely scenario is that nobody unauthorized had access to that log. I think Twitter is rightfully so erring on the side of caution and saying, well, if someone did get into one of our systems and did obtain a copy, everyone should change their passwords just in case. I don't think that's the case, although we'll never truly know unless someone claims to have everyone's Twitter password. I also thought it was astonishing that Twitter definitively said it was like everyone's password. Like there wasn't a subset. We talked about the RSA leak, right? It was a subset of the people, and a lot of these attacks are sometimes subsets of the. This was the every single Twitter user, which was kind of concerning. The scope of the hack, certainly, and the fact, the other bad thing about this, which is why I also believe that Twitter kind of sounded the alarm, was it was in clear text. Like it wasn't even the encrypted one where you'd have to crack them to get out. A lot of the password leaks we've seen in the past involve some level of cracking, and not that that's necessarily difficult, depending on how they encrypted it. But when you think about the volume of 300 million plus users, that's a lot of cracking. And I mean, sure, you have targeted attacks, but it wasn't even necessary. So this was bad for those reasons. I think there's probably a developer that had a heart attack or is on a downward spiral because they're the ones that left the debug code in, and I feel bad for whoever that person is.
Yeah. And honestly, though, the funniest thing about this is I get the feeling that there's probably a library in use that both Twitter and GitHub are using that caused this behavior to present itself. And so I suspect that at some point we may get a postmortem on it. I just hope that it comes sooner than later because I guarantee you there's other companies that could probably, derive some lessons from this as well. But at the same time, I'm sure that folks like Twitter and GitHub are a little bit tight-lipped about exactly how this presented itself, maybe out of embarrassment, or maybe just simply out of trying to protect companies from having mass panic as a result of the fact that they're also using this bad library. And there's no definitive way for you to know unless you go look at the code that maybe you implemented it badly. But that's kind of my suspicion at this point, is it's related to something in one of the libraries that they're using that caused this behavior to present itself.
I also think it's worth the headache of maintaining two-factor across your accounts.
Yes.
Which, to be quite honest, is a headache. Because sometimes you get a YubiKey, sometimes you get a text message, and sometimes you get an authenticator app. There really isn't anything that I've discovered when you're using other people's software applications that it's kind of like, oh, I have this one two-factor authentication thing. Like Facebook supports one type of YubiKey, the last I checked. Some services offer just text messages. Some let you choose between authenticator and text message. Some use the text message as a backup to your authenticator, which you might as well just dumb down to the least secure two-factor if you can't turn that off. And then if you turn that off and you're not good about keeping your phone or backing up your authenticator app settings, which admittedly I haven't really figured out, when you get a new phone, all your authenticator app stuff goes away, and then you're in a potentially a bad place.
For sure. And for me, the way that I generally deal with that, it's not the best practice, but it's a good one in my mind, is whenever you set up two-factor authentication, you have the ability to download a set of keys that you could use if you actually lost your phone or something
codes
of that nature.
Yep, I had that, thankfully.
Secure storage of that is hard, which is it's funny because what I ended up doing is I wrote a quick bash script that basically runs things through, I think it's OpenSSL. I forget the exact library that it uses, but it allows you to AES 256 encrypt anything with a password. So what I end up doing is I always download that file. I actually have it up on my GitHub. So github.com/and-my-hacks/scripts has my encrypt and my decrypt shell script files. And so I literally just run it through that. I set a password to it. I put that password in my password vault. And now I've got that file stored with all of my keys securely.
Right.
And then generally I put that on like a...
Yeah, and outside of your password vault, right? I mean, because you could put those backup codes inside your password vault as like a note or something, but one could then call into question, like, you've got your both factors of authentication essentially in your password vault. And I also know LastPass has something where they can manage those codes, which I haven't enabled because I'm paranoid, right? I don't want my factors mixing in with each other, right?
Right. And so for me, I usually put those on like an external hard disk as well, right? So my threat vector is literally twofold. Someone has literally stolen my external hard drive, and first of all, they have the password to that external drive that's already encrypted by itself. But then they must have access to my password vault as well. So I am limiting my factors of risk there pretty heavily. So that's probably the best way to deal with the situation in my mind is, first, yes, set up two-factor or multi-factor authentication of any kind. The inconvenience is worth it in my mind when you run into these situations. When you get notified by haveibeenpwned.com, thank you, Troy Hunt, that you've got there is a breach and your password may have been involved in that breach, or your hashed password may have been involved in that breach. Having that second factor gives you time, right, to address that appropriately, which I think is important. Moving on from that, though, I did want to talk about how under the "if you build it, they will come" story number 1, which is how somebody tried to hide a backdoor in a popular JavaScript NPM package. This package was specifically the get cookies package, which is relatively new, but it was actually bundled up into other packages, such as the mail parser package, as a dependency. And so the backdoor mechanism in this case would allow for people to effectively grab browser cookies, which, by the way, most websites use those for session management. And in this case, it would allow them to input arbitrary code into a running server and execute it. So effectively now you're running your server with the get cookies functionality to validate your sessions as the server administrator that has written this application that happens to rely on get cookies. And the backdoor now allows effectively, literally like remote code execution against your box because you're using that library. Now, I feel like we talked about exactly this problem in like episode 3 or episode 4, which was fictitious at the time of us discussing it just a couple of months ago, and here we are in May, and it's happened. Someone's already tried to do that. Paul, any additional thoughts here? I know that NPM and just recently bought Uplift, who does the node security package. So thoughts on this, Paul?
Yeah, I think it's along those lines of that acquisition, and I'm not sure what their technology looks like. And I know they're industry buzzwords, but it's certainly a great use case for machine learning and artificial intelligence to be able to review the code as automated as they can as it's committed. And maybe even take action with the artificial intelligence piece to make those happen. So people confuse the terms all the time, right? Machine learning, perhaps, to discover the patterns and identify the malicious add-ons or modules or plugins or whatever that we've discussed having this problem, and then AI that would go in and take action, based on the machine learning would be, I think, a great usage of that technology. That's, of course, a very, very high level of how it works or could work, for example. But I think this is a great use case for that.
Absolutely. And I think that Apple and Google try to do this in some ways with their respective, mobile stores. And so, yeah, this is yet another situation where the ubiquity of Node Package Manager across a number of different environments and frameworks and libraries it's pretty much the core of everything that you do when you're developing a modern web application.
Yeah, and so I mean, Apple and Google have the talent too, and Amazon, because don't forget, they all have their AI things that I won't say the names because it's going to trigger everyone's their device, right? But all of the verbal Siri and Amazon Echo and the Google stuff, right, all have their artificial intelligence. So they've got like the corner on the market of the technical people who can implement this. I would see those larger companies, and Apple has certainly proven this with their iOS market, right, being able to implement this type of technology. But the most talented people in the world, from what folks that have done the research have told me, like they pretty much work for those three companies, and they have that expertise. It'll be interesting to see if there are newer players that can bring to market this type of technology, specifically in this case, to protect malicious software from entering an ecosystem.
For sure, and especially an ecosystem that's becoming more and more important to modern web development. I mean, we covered in a previous show that 50% of the vulnerabilities in the CVE database that were reported and disclosed last year, again, that's not all of the vulnerabilities that were reported, but necessarily the ones that were reported, disclosed, and had a CVE number associated were web vulnerabilities. And here we are talking about a package that's used in a web server that ultimately allows for remote code execution. The thing that I found interesting about this,
I think 80% of those are WordPress plugins too.
Probably, I would not be surprised.
Pretty high percentage.
That was the case.
Yeah.
But what was interesting about this is, in this case, it was Mail Parser, which was a deprecated package that had the get cookies package as kind of a dependency. And even though Mail Parser was deprecated, it still had over 66,000 weekly downloads. I'm blaming Stack Overflow here. I'm willing to bet that there's probably some serious articles about doing parsing or mail parsing in this case with webmail of some kind, I'm sure is what the applications are related to, that says to use Mail Parser, even though it's a deprecated package. So to that end, it's like, okay, here's the situation that we were most afraid of, is people are using the knowledge that exists, which, by the way, is still dated and the knowledge base itself hasn't been deprecated, just the package that they talk about.
And it begs the question, Keith, in a development process, how do you discover and identify packages that your application is relying on that don't necessarily have a vulnerability, right? And the package isn't broken because I'm still able to pull it down, but how do you identify those as deprecated and make a note to the developer to say, it might not be critical, like right now it's not on fire, but by the way, this package has been deprecated and you might want to go out and find something else because there's no more updates coming to this particular package. That's something that I had not considered in our discussions on this show.
As a developer, admittedly, you generally just ignore the warnings that you're getting when you pull it down and you just keep going.
And now that I think about it, in our own internal application, I have seen that error. And I have largely ignored it because I'm like, oh, that's not a priority right now. But now in the context of our conversation about this vulnerability, I think it's something that we have to pay attention to. In that sense, in Python, it tells you when you start up your application that there are deprecated packages. So that's something you could certainly monitor and parse the logs, and with something like Jenkins or whatever, something in your process could identify that and tell you, and you would probably still just ignore it.
Most of the time you ignore it because you want it to work, and it's the fragile infrastructure problem, right? If you have not got the Docker containers loading this appropriately, where you can go and break this and see if you can actually get it to work appropriately, and kind of bang around on it, you're not going to fix it ultimately as a developer, which is the most unfortunate thing here. But back in August of last year, NPM actually did remove 38 JavaScript packages that were seen as malicious. And apparently, similar things happened with the Python package index, where they found in this case, let's see, does it say? It doesn't say in this case, but they did find a number of vulnerabilities in a similar scenario where you had dependencies that were deprecated that had malicious code in them. So if you see those warnings, do not ignore them. Actually try to go take a deeper look, because as much as it might be working today, first, as a security team or as a developer, build resilient development processes, and then go fix everything as much as possible. I know we have a few minutes left here. I also wanted to cover a couple of things. First, there was under story number 2 for the if you build it section that you can finally encrypt Slack messages. So I know that we talked, I think, on a previous show about how Slack allows any admin to read any message that you've sent in private DMs or otherwise on Slack. It is a specific setting that managers of a Slack channel can leverage. But in this case, a tool has been released, and it's called a Schlack. I think it's supposed to be like sh and Slack all at once. But in this case, it allows you to encrypt your messages so that way if you have a private message with someone else, it can't be read. It's by Minded Security. It's available as a browser extension or a patch for the Slack application. So just to kind of mention that, you use Slack internally. I know that we sometimes chat about or chat on Slack during the show, Paul. Any additional thoughts here?
Well, if you like Slack, I put a Slack channel inside your Slack channel, Keith.
Oh, there it is. There it is. Was that? It's not LL Cool J. Was it LL Cool J?
It was Exhibit. Yes.
Sorry.
Exhibit.
Sorry. I know. MTV show of old. The interesting thing that I thought about this was it's using Crypto.js, which is a JavaScript library that is not, from what they say here, it's not great. It relies on pre-shared keys, but in my mind, it's better than nothing. So definitely check that out. That's story number 2 under the if you build it, they will come section.
So it sounds like it's kind of like OTR was for like Pigeon and stuff like that. And it was over various protocols, instant messaging protocols, that if you generated a key, you could do a key handshake with someone else who had generated a key.
Yep.
Exchange public keys, right? And then have your messages encrypted to and from each other.
I think in this case, it's exactly a pre-shared key, but don't share it inside of Slack because that defeats the whole purpose, because someone could go read that pre-shared key and therefore they're not listening to your conversations, right? Like, so in effect, you need to, under a different encrypted channel, share the pre-shared key that you're going to use for your Slack discussions, so that way they can be encrypted now as well. So we ought to get Jeff Mann on to talk about this, because that man knows crypto better than anyone alive, as far as I'm concerned. Well, maybe not anyone alive, but most people I know personally. And so I'd love to get him to come on and talk about crypto. Moving ahead, because I did want to cover a couple of things. So under food for thought, there was a picture that I linked to that Chris Eng shared, which is from, I believe it was the most recent Amazon internal summit that they have, or internal conference that they have, which is called the Evolving Developer Mindset. I'll read it for the audience because I think it's important. And this is by Werner Vogels, the Amazon CTO, from last year's AWS reInvent. Werner says, security is everyone's job now, not just the security teams. With continuous integration and continuous deployment, all developers have to be security engineers. We move too fast for there to be time for reviews by the security team beforehand. That needs automation, and it needs to be integrated into your process. Each and every piece should get security integrated into it before and after being deployed. Amen. Any additional things to add here, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I somewhat disagree. I think that security's role is not just to identify vulnerabilities or identify, process improvements. I think a lot of it is being able to like qualify risk, right? And describe risk and paint a picture. and help do the threat modeling and just take into consideration all of the security controls and all of the security risks, and help developers with that. I mean, it's one thing to tell developers, well, you always have to be running the latest version. Like, we all know that's not going to happen. You have to put it in context. So
right.
I do see a security role living for the foreseeable future, if not to like rubber meets the road security, but helping with that process, and bringing the knowledge of and experience of security, because developers still need to be focused on developing code. And sure, they're going to play a larger role, I think, in the execution, but there's still that architecture phase that needs to happen. And I think security is going to play a role in that process. In fact, I'll talk about it in my talk on Wednesday. When you're putting together your architecture for whatever software, like let's say you're using Docker in a DevOps environment, when you put together your architecture, security has to be there to help with, that traditional security knowledge we have certainly applies to a microservices environment, let's say, because there are concepts, and I have it in air quotes, like networking, right? And
right.
data storage and configuration, and that stuff is there. It's just different today, but there's still a security architecture that has to be taken into consideration. And I don't think we should put it on developers to understand every different threat model there is out there and build the whole thing on their own. I think we have to help with that process. I think we should help with that process. And it's not because developers can't do it. It's that everyone has their different focus, right? We can't expect every developer to be a security expert. We need them to execute our security architecture, right? And they're going to take a larger role, I think, than more traditionally.
And I think that what will ultimately happen is security professionals, especially ones that work with software development teams in general, will almost become embedded in the software team, right? Like, they will be a person on that team that is identifying technologies that can allow them to deliver their product securely without having to think too much about it, which is ultimately, I think, where I see security professionals, especially application security professionals, moving toward. Now, there will always be those organizations that are, 10, 20, 50 years behind on the way that they do security or the way that they do development. But more and more, I think what will ultimately happen is those security professionals will need to understand how development actually works, and then also be able to identify technologies that can help the development team be better at their job without having to think about being secure in the process. They just will be. So two last things I wanted to cover is, first, it's a couple of weeks old now, but Haroon Mir and the folks at Thinkst, so they make canary.tools, which is like you can put a honeypot on files and things. They also make, of course, network-based canaries. They had a nice review of hosting their booth at RSA this year. And I thought, what a cool idea to take the process of going to RSA and treating it like a feedback loop, just like you would when you're doing development, right? You do A/B testing, you try to push it to production, and you do build testing. And so they actually took the whole concept of going out to RSA for just under $50K and did like an entire write-up and a reflection on it. Some of the things, of course, that they learned is talking about, price gouging by RSA for booth size, how vendors can be a little bit intense. And then also for them, it was actually a lot of value in their demo specifically. But I'll let folks read the article. That's story number 2 under the food for thought section. I'm a big fan of Haroon and the team over there at Thinkst, so I definitely recommend checking it out, especially if you work for a company that's thinking about having a booth at RSA. I think it's a very even-keeled review of, cost to value analysis for them, and for, I'm sure, other companies will find value there as well.
I think it was an interesting piece of the puzzle, and I think that attending an event and having a presence there is just, it's one part of your go-to-market plan. And I thought I thought their analysis of the actual RSA conference itself was good, and I appreciate them sharing that information. I think that's a good piece of knowledge to have. However, I didn't think the article kind of spoke to how that fits into your overall nurturing campaign.
Right.
And, these are conversations we have on Business Security Weekly, certainly not necessarily for here, but it didn't speak to the full picture. I also think that if you can make sales right at RSA, that's great. Also consider, could you have made those somewhere else, or how that fits in your overall plan to nurture people and have it be part of your program. In that sense, maybe the investment was worthwhile, maybe it wasn't. It depends on how you look at it, right? And I think that you can make more of your return on investment by having a an encompassing marketing plan that taking what, you know, Haroon and team had put together and taking that into consideration as to what it costs and what the value is and incorporating that into a larger plan. I just, you know, I thought that was something that was, you know, not necessarily missing, but it was a piece of the puzzle.
Sure, sure. This was we get the microservices architecture view of this. We got to see just this containers view of the overall picture. And you're right. There's a bigger picture here to be orchestrated by marketing teams and product development teams and of course you know, sales teams, right? Yep. So I liked it from the perspective of it was a ground truth review of their experience in the booth, but it is a microcosm, for lack of a better term. You're right, Paul. It's not an overall picture of everything that they're going to do this year, but it's if you are going to do RSA and only going to do RSA, these are the things to take away from it. So I thought that was good. The last thing I did want to cover here, of course, there is our favorite commit strip under number 5 for food for thought. That's reading an article on your phone for 2018. But the last thing I did want to talk about was VS Code extensions for happier JavaScript coding. Myself, I'm a huge fan of VS Code, and so it does have a few must-haves in there. That's ESLint, GitLens, to-do highlight, and import cost. Of those, the one that I'm going to highlight here is the import cost plugin, which quite literally will tell you in almost like a commented fashion next to every import you do in your code, how large of an import it is that you are now inferring, whether that's, you know, 64 kilobytes or 5 kilobytes, which, as I'm sure you've probably seen, Paul, development today seems to just be using as much possible space on your system as it can consume. And so in this case, I thought that was kind of cool. Any additional thoughts for that particular one? I know that you must be doing at least a decent number of imports on your, you know, post-production works tool.
Sure. Yeah. And, you know, I think it speaks to containers in one of your goals. And it's not something that's easy when you take an existing application, certainly, and start to put that in a container environment. To get your containers as small as possible is really hard, but it's really important, right? Like it helps with the entire flow of your DevOps process to have those containers be as small as possible, and looking at your imports is certainly part of that. So I like this tool that it can help me make sure that my containers are as small as possible, because that, I mean, that can, in large environments, I mean, that can have some pretty big impacts as to how much you spend in compute power, cost, like the whole development workflow, making that software development process as fast as possible really comes down to speed. I think it's one of the huge advantages between containers and virtualization is it gives you that ability to really trim down your containers.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And especially like if you're doing that today with a JavaScript application, I know that, you know, importing things from Node can be immense. And so if you're going to import just the piece that you need rather than the whole 9 yards, it's going to make your life a whole lot better. The last couple of nice to haves that they include for extensions is Prettier, which is a code formatter, Open in Browser, which I use personally, VS Code styled components, and Bookmarks, which I thought was kind of an interesting concept. I went and grabbed it as soon as I saw it, which is basically bookmarking parts of your code if it isn't necessarily readable or you don't know exactly where a function is going to live because you have kind of, you know, disparate or dispersed code that you've written for different functions or different packages inside of your application. I thought Bookmarks was pretty cool because now you can kind of quickly jump between things inside of your application. Because, Paul, as you and I both know, documentation is a pipe dream sometimes.
Yeah, certainly.
Cool. Well, with that, thank you everyone for joining us this week for another episode of Application Security Weekly. Remember to git commit and stay classy.